Hello everyone, welcome to my video on the most famed expedition in history, the Lewis and Clark expedition. In this video, I will be describing where Lewis and Clark went, what they saw along the way, who they met, and the impact they had on the US then and to this day. Let's begin. Meriwether Lewis, better known by his last name of Lewis, was born on August 18, 1774, in the village of Ivy in Virginia. He would later on fight against the Whiskey Rebellion people under the Virginia Voluntary Militia. Then he entered politics, eventually becoming secretary to the president at the time. By the way, this job was kind of like an advisor. Thomas Jefferson, who I recently made a video on. On August 1st, 1770, in Ladysmith, Virginia, was the birth of William Clark, better known by his last name, Clark. After, he too joined a militia, eerie coincidence, this time under Colonel Major John Hardin in the Northwest Indian War. They did what Americans and the British at the time did best, massacre innocent natives. In this case, killing 8 peaceful Shawnee natives doing nothing wrong. Clark later became a general for Thomas Jefferson. On April 30th, 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased Louisiana Territory from Napoleon, egotistical emperor of France who liked seeing how far he could stick his hand down his shirt, since France was still broke from the UK beating them in wars, also causing the UK to be bankrupt. Jefferson then purchased the Louisiana Territory for $15 million in money at the time, or in other words, now enough money to buy 28,571,428 yodeling pickles, which equates to $300 million in today's money. Now, Jefferson needed to send people westward into the territory he bought to make sure that the French didn't screw him over. To send people out, Jefferson established the Corps of Discovery in 1803, which he placed Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in the positions of captains. And so, Lewis and Clark grabbed their luggage, their supplies, got on their wagons, and traveled to Missouri to begin their expedition. On this day, May 14th, 217 years ago, in 1804, Lewis and Clark, along with their crew, departed from Camp Du Bois in what is now St. Louis, Missouri, officially beginning their expedition. Then, they traversed all of Missouri, ending up at what is now Kansas City in Missouri and Kansas. By this point, one of the most important crew members they had, Charles Floyd, no, not that one, this one, died of explosive appendicitis. They then traveled northward along the Missouri River, the longest in the U.S., eventually reaching Omaha, Nebraska, and not getting any stakes. They kept pushing north along the Missouri past what is now the city of Pierre, South Dakota. After getting to what is now Bismarck, North Dakota, you can probably guess how many cities they inspired the locations of by now. In winter of 1804, Lewis and Clark built Fort Mandan, named after the local tribe, because they were paranoid of the Arikara tribe to the west, who they called the, quote, vilest miscreants of the savage race. They would remain at Fort Mandan for the rest of the brutal winter of 1804. During their time stopped at Fort Mandan came the arrival of a couple. The male was named Chasol Chachano, who was married to a Shoshone native who you may know as Sacagawea. Yes, her name is pronounced like that, and yes, this is a real photo of her. After meeting Chachano in Sacagawea, the expedition carried along the Missouri, later reaching Montana. With nothing really happening here, sorry Montanans, the crew later on reached Idaho, after passing the Lemmy Pass. Eventually, Lewis and Clark reached the Clearwater River, which took them to the mighty Columbia River, and hence Washington and Oregon, which now use this river as their southern and northern border. By this point, Lewis and Clark had sighted Mount Hood and Mount St. Helens, which had a bad day in 1980. After sighting these volcanoes, Lewis and Clark added them to their highly detailed and beautiful journals. And finally, after 2 agonizingly long weeks later, on November 7th, 1805, Lewis and Clark, as well as their expedition crew, reached the Pacific Ocean after long almost 2 years of fighting, going to peace, and encounters with unknown people. Now, they had to get back to St. Louis, and later D.C., where the president was waiting for them. Later on, near the Idaho-Montana border, Lewis and Clark's expedition split in two because Lewis wanted to look at water, and Clark wanted to get business done. Lewis's expedition would later go to New Mexico, evade getting murdered by the Spanish, and try and kind of fail to get back to DC. During this time, Lewis became severely depressed after becoming governor of the Louisiana Territory due to Thomas Jefferson demanding that he finish his journals. Jefferson just wouldn't shut up. He was like a broken record. As for Clark, he and his expedition went straight to St. Louis, eventually getting back to the East Coast early, where he would remain for the rest of his life. He would retain diplomatic ties with the Mandan people in North Dakota and was supportive of them when he heard they were being devastated by smallpox. And now back to Meriwether Lewis, who by now is an emotional wreck. His depression is skyrocketing, and while in Nashville, Tennessee, not much was improving. And so, on October 19th, 1809, along the notoriously dangerous Natchez Trail trying to get back to DC, Lewis was shot at his hotel. To this day, no one knows if his shooting was a suicide or a murder. Later, in 1838, in St. Louis, Missouri, William Clark died likely of natural causes, much more peacefully than his companion Lewis. Ever since the Lewis and Clark expedition, a lot has happened as a result of it. For one, 22 states that were either in the Louisiana Territory entirely, partially, were explored by Lewis and Clark, or bordered states that they were in were added to the U.S. Plus, Lewis and Clark also discovered 177 new plant species and 122 new animal species, including famous ones like grizzly bears and bighorn sheep. This greatly expanded biological knowledge of North America. Lewis and Clark also established diplomatic ties with mostly 50 native tribes across the Missouri River. The ones on the east were a little bit envious because of their situation. But overall, Lewis and Clark were a force of good. And with that was my history of the Lewis and Clark expedition. It had a lot of good and some bad in it. But whether you liked it or not, it happened, and that was my history of it. As for what is coming up next, my next video will be on something that I mentioned in this video. My next video will be on the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It will come out on May 18th. Thanks for watching.